The rudder angle indicator froze at 20 degrees starboard, and the heavy ship began a slow, unstoppable turn toward the rocky riverbank. The Pacific Trader was a 20-year-old bulk carrier fully loaded with grain and sitting low in the water. We were transiting the Columbia River, heading outbound toward the ocean. It was a Tuesday morning around 800 hours. The weather was typical for the Pacific Northwest. A low gray sky and a steady drizzle that required the windshield wipers on the bridge windows to run constantly. The visibility was about 3 miles. The river current was strong that day, running at about 4 knots following the ship, pushing us along faster than we wanted to go. On the bridge, the atmosphere was quiet and professional. Captain Miller stood near the radar screen on the port side. He was a man in his 60s with 40 years of experience at sea. He drank his coffee from a thick white mug and watched the river traffic. The local river pilot, Mr. Henderson, stood at the center window. His job was to guide the ship through the twisting channel sandbars. At the helm stood Torres, an able seaman who had been with the company for 5 years. He held the small steering wheel loosely, making minor adjustments to keep the bow steady. The ship was moving at 10 knots over the ground. The engine was set to slow ahead. We were approaching a sharp bend in the river known as a difficult spot for large vessels. The channel narrowed there, with a sandbank on the left and a rocky shoreline on the right. A calm rhythm filled the wheelhouse. The hum of the ventilation, the rhythmic click of the gyro repeater, and the occasional crackle of the VHF radio. Down in the engine room, the chief engineer, Olson, was completing his morning rounds. The machinery was running smoothly. All pressures and temperatures were normal. There was no indication of trouble. The ship felt solid and responsive. The pilot gave a routine command to start the turn around the bend. "Starboard 10, Pilot Henderson said clearly. He looked out at the channel markers, judging the distance to the turn. "Starboard 10, Torres repeated. He turned the small wheel to the right. He watched the rudder angle indicator mounted on the ceiling. The red needle moved to the 10-degree mark and stopped. The ship began to swing its bow to the right, initiating the turn. We passed the first marker. The ship swung steadily. The current pushed against the stern, increasing the rate of the turn. It was time to check the swing and straighten the vessel out to stay in the center of the channel. "Midships," the pilot ordered. "Midships," Torres repeated. He turned the wheel back to the center position. Captain Miller looked up at the indicator. The needle did not move. It remained fixed at 10 degrees to starboard. The ship continued to turn right, digging deeper into the turn than intended. "Midships, sir," Torres said, his voice tightening slightly. "The wheel is at 0. The rudder is not moving." The pilot looked at the indicator. He frowned. "Hard to port," he ordered quickly. He wanted to force the hydraulic valves to open. Torres spun the wheel all the way to the left. "Hard to port, sir." The 3 men stared at the indicator. The red needle stayed at 10 degrees starboard. The ship's bow was now swinging past the intended heading. The rocky bank on the starboard side was becoming a prominent view in the window. The distance to the shore was less than half a mile and closing. Captain Miller reacted immediately. He stepped to the steering console. "Steering failure," he announced calmly. He reached for the pump selector switch. The ship usually ran on one hydraulic pump during normal transit. He twisted the heavy black knob to engage the second pump. The pump 2 running light illuminated green. The captain looked at the indicator. Nothing happened. The rudder was hydraulically locked in position. "No response on pump 2, Miller said, switching to non-follow-up. He flipped a guarded switch to bypass the electronic wheel and used the direct lever controller. This was a backup system that sent electrical signals directly to the steering gear solenoids. He pushed the lever to the left. He held it there for 5 seconds. The rudder indicator did not twitch. The ship was still swinging right. The rate of turn was increasing because the current was hitting the port quarter, pushing the tail of the ship around. "Stop engine," the pilot ordered. "Full astern." Captain Miller grabbed the engine telegraph handle. He pulled it from slow ahead to stop, waited 1 second, and then pulled it all the way back to full astern. The telegraph rang sharply in the quiet bridge. "Captain, call the engine room," the pilot said. "We need that rudder centered now. We are losing the channel." Miller picked up the sound-powered telephone. He pressed the button for the control room. It rang once, twice. Control room, Chief speaking, Olson answered. Chief, we have total steering failure, Miller said, keeping his voice flat and loud. Rudder is jammed at starboard 10. We are in the river. We are going full astern. Check the steering gear immediately. Understood. Going to the steering flat, Olson replied. The line clicked dead. On the bridge, the vibration of the engine shook the floor plates. The propeller was churning the water in reverse, trying to stop the ship's forward momentum. However, a loaded bulk carrier weighs nearly 80,000 tons. It does not stop quickly. The reverse thrust also had a side effect. The propeller walk tended to push the stern to port, which unfortunately helped the bow swing further to starboard. The pilot grabbed the VHF radio handset. Security, security, security. This is the Pacific Trader. We have lost steering at mile marker 42. We are drifting to the starboard bank. Any traffic in the vicinity, keep clear. Torres stood by the useless wheel. Sir, heading is now 130. We are 30 degrees off course. Captain Miller looked out the starboard wing window. The trees on the riverbank looked distinct and individual now. He could see a small fishing boat tied to a pier roughly 400 yards ahead of their impact point. Sound the emergency alarm, Miller told the third mate who had just entered the bridge. Get the crew to the anchor stations. Prepare the starboard anchor. The alarm bell began to ring throughout the ship, 7 short blasts followed by 1 long blast. The sound was deafening. It signaled that the situation was no longer just a mechanical glitch. It was an emergency. Down below, Chief Engineer Olson grabbed his radio and a flashlight. He ran out of the air-conditioned control room and into the heat of the engine room. He slid down the steep steel ladders, bypassing the main engine cylinder heads. He hit the bottom deck plates and sprinted toward the aft tunnel. The steering gear room was located at the very back of the ship, directly over the rudder. It was a long run. Back on the bridge, the speed log showed the ship slowing down. 8 knots, 7 knots, but the turn was continuing. The ship was sliding sideways through the water, carried by the heavy river current. The bow was pointing directly at the rocky shoreline. She's not answering to the engine astern fast enough, the pilot said. Captain, if we don't get the rudder over, we are going ground, hard. Miller watched the shoreline. Chief is on his way. Anchors are being cleared. The phone rang. Miller snatched it. Bridge, Miller said. I'm at the steering gear. Olson shouted over the noise of the hydraulic pumps. The linkage is intact. The pumps are running. But the solenoids aren't firing. It looks like an electrical control failure from the bridge line. I'm going to try to operate it locally. Do it fast, Miller said. We have less than 2 minutes before we hit the bank. The ship groaned as the engine fought the momentum. The bow was now looming over the shallow water markers. The situation had escalated from a technical fault to an imminent grounding. The safety of the vessel and the crew depended entirely on whether the engineers could manually force the massive steel rudder to move against the pressure of the water. In the steering gear room, the noise was overwhelming. The 2 massive hydraulic pumps were screaming, laboring against the trapped oil pressure. Chief Engineer Olson ignored the noise and grabbed the local control wheel, a small brass helm mounted on the steering flat console. He switched the control lever from remote to local. He spun the wheel hard to the left. He watched the mechanical linkage on the rudder stock. It did not move. The heavy steel rams remained extended, holding the rudder locked at 10 degrees starboard. It's not the electrical signal, Olson shouted to the second engineer who had just arrived sliding down the ladder. The hydraulic spool valve is physically jammed. It's stuck in the open position. The second engineer, a large man named Davila, looked at the complex manifold of pipes and valves. We have to force it back manually, Davila said. Well, we need the big pipe wrench. Olson grabbed the sound-powered phone. Bridge, this is Chief. Local control failed. The valve is mechanically seized. We are attempting to force it with tools. We need 2 minutes. On the bridge, Captain Miller hung up the phone. His face was grim. He looked at the radar. The distance to the bank was now 300 yards. The current was pushing the ship sideways at a speed of 4 knots. The reverse thrust from the engine was slowing the forward speed, but it was doing nothing to stop the sideways drift toward the rocks. We don't have 2 minutes, Pilot Henderson said. He looked at the captain. If we don't stop the bow from swinging right, we're going to hit that fishing pier. The ship was heavy and sluggish. The vibration from the engine running full astern rattled the windows in their frames. The coffee mug on the console slid 2 inches to the left. "The bow is swinging too fast," Captain Miller observed. "The prop walk is pushing the stern to port, but the current is catching the starboard side." The pilot made a decision. "We have to dredge the anchor. It's the only way to snub the bow." "Stand by starboard anchor," Captain Miller barked into the UHF radio. On the forecastle deck, the chief officer and the boatswain were waiting. The rain was falling harder now, slicking the green deck paint. They were wearing orange rain gear and hard hats. The wind whipped around them. "Stand by," the chief officer signaled with his hand. The boatswain stepped up to the windlass brake. He placed his hands on the heavy iron wheel that controlled the friction brake for the anchor chain. "Let go," the radio crackled. "Let go, 2 shots on deck," the chief officer signaled. The boatswain spun the brake wheel counterclockwise. The friction released. The gravity of the 3-ton anchor took over. Clack, 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 clack. The chain roared out of the hawse pipe. Rust dust flew into the air, mixing with the rain. The noise was like machine gun fire. The heavy steel links hammered against the deck plates as they vanished down the hole. "Hold it," the chief officer shouted. The boatswain tightened the brake with all his strength. The brake band screeched against the drum. Smoke rose from the friction. The chain stopped abruptly. The ship shuddered as the weight of the anchor hit the riverbed and dug into the mud. On the bridge, the effect was immediate. The bow, snagged by the anchor, stopped swinging to the right. The chain pulled tight, acting like a pivot point. "Chain is tight, 6 o'clock, the chief officer reported. "Very good," the captain said, "dead slow astern." He reduced the engine power to reduce the strain on the chain. However, a new problem emerged immediately. The bow was held by the anchor, but the ship still had momentum. The current was still pushing the hull. The vessel began to pivot around the anchor. The stern, which was free, started to swing wildly toward the rocky bank. The ship was turning broadside to the river. "She's pivoting," the pilot said, pointing to the stern. "We are losing the stern. We need to kick it away." "Rudder is still jammed," Miller said. He watched the rate of turn indicator. The stern was swinging toward the shore at 20 degrees per minute. In the steering flat, Olson and Davila were fighting the machine. The hydraulic system operated at high pressure over 2,000 psi. Forcing the valve against that pressure was dangerous. If a seal blew, high-pressure oil could slice through skin like a knife. "Get the cheater bar," Olson yelled. Davila grabbed a 3-foot length of steel pipe and slid it over the handle of the pipe wrench. He clamped the wrench jaws onto the exposed stem of the stuck directional valve. "I'll release the pressure on the return line," Olson said. He moved to a smaller valve on the bypass line. "On my mark. 1, 2, 3. Olson cracked the bypass valve. Hot oil hissed loudly. Simultaneously, Davila put his full weight on the cheater bar, pushing down to force the stuck valve stem inward. The metal groaned. The wrench slipped slightly, then bit in again. Davila grunted, sweat pouring down his face in the hot room. "It's moving," Davila shouted. "It's moving." On the bridge, the proximity alarm on the GPS started beeping. The stern was now only 50 meters from the shallow water line. The view from the starboard wing showed the rocks clearly. The water was churning brown and muddy near the bank. "Depth under the stern is 6 meters, the third mate called out. The ship drew 5 meters. They had 1 meter of clearance. "Hard to port," the pilot shouted, hoping the engineers had succeeded. "Give me a kick ahead." Captain Miller slammed the telegraph to half ahead. The engine room answered instantly. The propeller stopped spinning astern and began to churn forward. The wash from the propeller rushed over the rudder. If the rudder was still jammed to starboard, this burst of speed would drive them straight into the bank. It was a gamble that the engineers had finished their job. In the steering room, the valve stem popped free with a loud metallic clunk. The hydraulic fluid rushed into the opposing cylinder. "It's free!" Olson yelled. He grabbed the local control wheel. He spun it furiously to the left. The massive rams began to retract. The thick steel tiller arm moved. On the bridge, all eyes were on the rudder angle indicator. For 20 minutes, it had been stuck at 10 degrees starboard. Suddenly, the needle twitched. It swept past 0. It moved to 10 degrees port, then 20. "Rudder's hard to port," Torres shouted from the helm, though he wasn't touching the wheel. The control was still with the chief engineer below. "Engine full ahead," the pilot ordered. "Why? We need maximum thrust to push the stern out." Captain Miller pushed the lever to the stops. The ship vibrated heavily as the engine revved up to full power. The propeller wash hit the angled rudder. The force generated a massive sideways lift. Slowly, painfully slowly, the stern began to stop its swing toward the rocks. The gap between the ship's hull and the rocky bank stabilized at 40 meters. The trees on the shore stopped getting larger. "She's checking," Miller said, watching the compass. "The swing has stopped. Keep her coming," the pilot said. Push the stern out into the river. Don't stop until we are parallel with the flow." The ship groaned under the stress. The anchor chain at the bow was singing like a violin string, tight as a solid bar of iron. The ship was fighting two forces, the anchor holding the bow and the engine pushing the stern. "Chief mate," Miller radioed, "how is the chain?" "Chain is under extremely heavy tension, Captain," the radio replied. "It's vibrating hard. I think the brake is slipping. If the chain snapped now, the bow would fly loose and the momentum would slingshot the ship back toward the danger. Ease the engine to slow ahead," the pilot said. "We have the angle now. Let's not break the gear." Miller pulled the throttle back. The vibration lessened. The stern was now safe, pointing away from the bank. The ship was sitting diagonally in the channel, nose held by the anchor, stern out in deep water. "Bridge, this is Chief," the phone buzzed. "I have manual control of the steering. The valve is free, but I have to steer it from down here. I can't give you bridge control back yet." "Understood, Chief," Miller said. "Hold the rudder at hard port until further notice." The immediate danger of grounding was over, but the ship was now effectively anchored in the middle of a narrow shipping channel with a strong current, unable to steer from the bridge and blocking traffic in both directions. "Act 2 complete," Miller whispered to himself, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He looked at the pilot. "We are afloat." "Just barely," the pilot replied. "Now we have to get out of here." The immediate crisis of the grounding was over, but the Pacific trader was now in a precarious position. We were stationary in a high-traffic river channel pointing diagonally across the current. The rudder was still disconnected from the bridge. The chief engineer was steering the ship blindly from the steering gear. Room, 4 decks down, listening only to voice commands over a telephone line. "Bridge to steering flat." Captain Miller spoke into the headset. "Chief, do you hear me clearly?" "Loud and clear, Captain." Olson's voice came back, tinny and mixed with the roar of the hydraulic pumps. "I am standing by the local wheel. I can give you any angle you need, but it will be slower than normal." "Understood," Miller said. He looked at Pilot Henderson. "We are ready." The pilot nodded. "We cannot stay here. The tide is dropping. We need to heave up the Apice anchor and make way to the Astoria anchorage. It is 6 miles downstream. The channel is wider there. The problem was the delay. In normal operation, the rudder responds instantly. Now, the pilot would give an order. The captain would repeat it into the phone, the chief would turn the manual wheel, and the hydraulics would finally respond. That 5-second lag meant the pilot had to anticipate the river current well in advance. "Dead slow ahead," the pilot ordered. Miller moved the telegraph. The engine rumbled. The ship crept forward, easing the tension on the anchor chain. "Heave up anchor," Miller ordered the chief officer on the radio. On the bow, the windlass groaned. The chain began to rattle back into the locker. The chief officer watched the links coming out of the water. "Anchor is away," the chief officer reported. "Anchor is clear of the bottom. Current is catching the bow," the pilot warned. "Hard to starboard. We need to straighten out." "Hard to starboard, Chief," Miller shouted into the phone. "Hard to starboard," Olson replied. It took 6 seconds. The ship's bow began to swing left, pushed by the current. The rudder finally bit into the water. The bow slowed its swing and began to come right. "Midships," the pilot said early, anticipating the momentum. "Midships, Chief," Miller relayed. "Midships," Olson answered. The ship straightened out in the channel. We were moving at 6 knots. The river here was winding with sandbars on both sides. "Steer 105, the pilot said, "but watch the drift." For the next hour, the bridge was a scene of intense, focused concentration. There was no casual conversation. There was only the loop of commands. "Port 10, Port 10, Chief. Port 10, aye. Starboard 5, Starboard 5, Chief. Starboard 5, aye." Down in the steering flat, Chief Olson and Second Engineer Davila were sweating in the heat. They took turns on the brass wheel. They could not see the river, the rocks, or the channel markers. They stared at the brass graduations on the rudder post. Their world was just the needle and the captain's voice. If they made a mistake, or if the line cut out, the ship would ground. On the bridge, the pilot sweated too. He had to visualize the ship's position 10 seconds into the future. He ordered turns before the bends actually appeared. "Coming up on the tongue point turn," the pilot said. "This is the sharpest one. Current is strong on the beam." The ship approached the green channel marker. The water was choppy. "Hard to port," the pilot ordered. "Hard to port, Chief," Miller said loudly. "Hard to port," Olson replied. The ship plowed forward. For a long moment, it didn't turn. The current pushed the vessel toward the green buoy. The distance closed, 50 meters, 40 meters. "She's not coming around fast enough," Torres said from the helm, even though he wasn't steering. "Kick ahead half," the pilot said. "We need more wash on the rudder." Miller bumped the throttle. The engine surged. The propeller wash hit the angled rudder plate. The bow swung sharply to port, clearing the buoy by less than 20 meters. "Midships, hard to starboard. Check the swing," the pilot barked. "Hard to starboard, Chief." The delay felt like an hour. Then the bow stopped its swing and steadied. The difficult turn was behind them. The river widened. The tension in the wheelhouse dropped slightly. "Astoria anchorage dead ahead," the pilot said, exhaling a long breath. "Let's pick a spot and drop the hook. We need to fix this properly." They guided the heavy ship out of the main channel and into the designated anchorage zone. The water here was deep and calm. "Stop engine," the pilot said. "Stop engine," Miller repeated. The vibration ceased. The ship glided silently. "Let go, port anchor." The roar of the chain returned, but this time it was a controlled, safe deployment. The anchor hit the bottom. The ship slowed to a halt. "Finished with engines," Miller said into the phone. "Chief, secure the steering gear. We are safe at anchor." "Understood, Captain," Olson replied. His voice sounded exhausted, disconnecting local control. 2 hours later, the ship was quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving a damp chill in the air. The deck lights hummed. In the steering gear room, the machinery was silent for the first time that day. Chief Engineer Olson and the second engineer had dismantled the hydraulic directional valve. It was a heavy block of steel filled with complex channels for oil. They placed the internal spool on a clean rag on the workbench. "There," Olson said, pointing with a screwdriver. "That's the killer." Wedged deep inside the valve port was a small, jagged piece of metal, no bigger than a fingernail. It was a fragment from a filter screen that had failed. It had traveled through the pipes and lodged itself exactly where the valve needed to close. It had mechanically locked the system, making electronic control impossible. $5 worth of metal, the second engineer said, wiping grease from his hands. "It almost cost us the ship." Olson nodded. He picked up the fragment with pliers and dropped it into a plastic bag. "Save it for the insurance surveyor." Up in the ship's office, Captain Miller sat at his desk. He opened the official logbook. He picked up his black pen. His hand was steady, though his shoulders ached. He wrote in the standard, factual language of the sea. 10:45, vessel anchored safely at Astoria anchorage position C4. 11 bots hours. Inspection of steering gear completed by Chief Engineer. 11:15, cause of failure identified. Metal debris jamming the starboard hydraulic directional valve. 11:30, repairs commenced. Coast Guard notified. All crew safe. No pollution. No damage to hull. He closed the book. He stood up and looked out the porthole. The lights of Astoria twinkled on the shore. The river flowed past the ship, black and indifferent. The Pacific trader was just another shadow. On the water, floating quietly, preparing for the next day's work. The incident was over.